Nirvana blew up with Nevermind, launched grunge into the mainstream, and turned Seattle from a dreary, forgotten backwater into the epicenter of a global movement. Seattle in the late 80s was a weird, isolated place. Gray skies, constant rain, and a music scene that was loud, angry, and didn't give a damn about hair metal. But by this time, 80s hair metal bands were getting pretty carbon copied left and right, with all the same gravity-defying hairdos and power ballads running rampant. It was only a matter of time before whiplash would have to set in and turn everything on its head. And in this case, grunge proved to be up to the task. There was a certain organic vibe to it that was polar opposite of the reverb-drenched, wailing, screaming, candy-coated melodies that people were starting to really get sick of. Bret Michaels from Poison nailed it, basically saying that grunge didn't kill glam metal. Glam metal did that all by itself. The late 80s, hard partying, over-sexualized, pretty boy rock scene had pushed excess to the absolute limit. By the time the early 90s rolled around, it was bloated, predictable, and would turn out to be a little embarrassing to many involved in that scene later on. The mainstream didn't turn on glam because Seattle showed up. It turned on glam because it had actually become a parody of itself. And while all that was going on, something was bubbling in the Seattle music scene. The bands grinding it out in basement shows and dingy clubs there weren't trying to impress MTV. They were just playing the kind of music that felt natural in a city where everything seemed permanently damp and a little miserable. Grunge wasn't some grand cultural mission statement. It was born out of boredom, cheap beer, and a whole lot of distortion by people who didn't want to dine guyliner, shred, or wail, or have their songs drenched in reverb. And then came Nevermind. More specifically, then came Smells Like Teen Spirit. The opening riff alone was a Molotov cocktail lobbed at the polished, neon-drenched excess of the 80s. It was Godzilla sped up. Familiar enough that it welcomed new ears, thanks to Blue Oyster Cult cracking that open. And I'm sure any aspiring songwriters who caught this are definitely taking note. Familiarity is about as close to a surefire hit as it can get, provided you can cleverly sidestep copyright. And before moving on to those that argue that Teen Spirit is based on More Than a Feeling by Boston, I wholeheartedly disagree. Teen Spirit follows Godzilla way too closely, while the Boston tune is actually in a major key. Teen Spirit is not in a major key. Nevertheless, I look forward to the battle on this one in the comment section. Moving on, Teen Spirit wasn't just a hit, it was a full-on tidal wave. MTV played the video on repeat. Every kid with a guitar tried to learn it. Suddenly, the underground wasn't underground anymore. Nirvana didn't simply put grunge on the map. They were the map. Seattle, a place most people thought was just one big tall tower surrounded by a few houses, was now the place. Flannel, ripped jeans, combat boots weren't just fashion choices. They were either what you slept in or what you threw on as you stumbled downstairs to have some beer and cereal. Major labels tripped over themselves to sign any band that looked like they had skipped a few showers and listened to the Stooges. And for a brief, wild moment, the city that had been known for coffee, rain, and airplanes became the center of the universe. But like anything that burns too hot, grunge had a short shelf life. The thing about being anti-mainstream is that once you become the mainstream, the whole phenomenon kind of collapses. Nirvana blew the doors open, but Kurt Cobain never wanted to be a spokesperson for anything. By the time he died in '94, the movement that Nevermind had ignited was already starting to eat itself alive. The rain may not have stopped in Seattle, but the music scene there definitely dried up. The industry had milked grunge for all that it was worth and then moved on. And the irony? The movement was built on rejecting commercialism, and yet became one of the most commercially successful cultural exploitations in music history. And really, grunge defined the 90s. Music would never be the same again. The thing about grunge is that it wasn't some carefully curated political movement or deep philosophical statement. It basically was just loud, pissed-off music made by people who didn't fit in, for people who didn't belong anywhere else. Grunge was about extremes. It didn't matter if it leaned more punk, metal, or just straight-up noise. What mattered was that it was original, a bit on the messy side, and loud as hell. You weren't supposed to play clean solos or hit perfect harmonies. You were supposed to bash out something that felt genuine, something that sounded like a kick in the ass to whatever suburban nightmare you might have been stuck in at the time. And for kids listening, it wasn't just music, it was a lifeline. Grunge was an outlet for people who were fed up, depressed, or bored. Whether you were moshing in a tiny club, screaming along to Cobain's half-mumbled lyrics, or just blasting Nevermind in your room to drown out your parents' slow-moving divorce, grunge understood you. It was a soundtrack for feeling like life sucked, but at least you weren't alone in it. And yeah, grunge bled into everything. Fashion, attitude, politics. It wasn't aiming to be a movement, but it became one because it rejected everything fake, polished, and corporate. And the 80s had been all about gloss and excess, big hair, huge stadium shows, monumental egos. Grunge was designed to reject all of that. It wasn't just anti-establishment, it was anti-everything. Some felt it opened up spaces for voices that had been drowned out, whether it was women in rock through the Riot Grrrl movement, or just regular kids who felt alienated. But let's not over-intellectualize it. At its core, grunge was a bunch of sweaty people in flannel, cranking their amps and playing as if they had nothing to lose, because most of them really didn't. And no one had a bigger hand in turning grunge into a movement than Sub Pop. Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman took all that unrefined, unpolished chaos happening in basements, tiny venues, and transformed it into something the outside world could actually hear. Sub Pop wasn't just a label, it was the grunge factory, branding the sound, the look, and the attitude. They would sign bands, but they would also create a whole mythology around the Seattle scene itself. It was grimy, genuine, and for a little while it felt like the last great rock upheaval before the machine would swallow it whole. Now, nobody in 1991 was sitting around thinking, "Ah, yes, Seattle's grand cultural contribution to the world." No, they were watching a bleach blonde Cobain thrash around in a high school gym screaming about being stupid and contagious. Seattle didn't set out to make history, it just happened to be the right mix of penniless musicians, relentless weather, and a DIY scene that didn't give a damn about polish. And sure, grunge left its mark. The sound, the look, got absorbed into mainstream culture, whether bands intended to or not. But without getting too sentimental about Seattle finding itself, it was just a bunch of bands making noise in a place nobody cared about until suddenly everybody did. As far as the look is concerned, it was never really meant to be a look, so to speak. It was just simply what these guys wore. When Kurt Cobain threw on that ragged olive green cardigan for MTV, it wasn't a calculated fashion statement. It was literally just his cardigan. Just as Vedder's army boots and Cornell's cargo shorts were simply what made sense for a bunch of musicians playing in the rainy Pacific Northwest. But of course, once grunge went mainstream, the industry did what it always does. Turned it into a brand and sold it back to the very kids who once embraced it as a rebellion against consumer-driven, polished culture. It started getting called unfashion, and for a moment, it was pretty spot on. The whole vibe was anti-style. Shaggy hair, thrift store finds, flannels worn for practicality rather than appearance. And then by 92, designers in New York began cranking out grunge-inspired clothing, and department stores dedicated entire sections to it. Flannels started costing an arm and a leg, as did relict jeans. But the smart ones just hit the thrift stores. That was at least until the thrift stores would sell out of all those clothes. But whether the bands liked it or not, Seattle was now the new rock capital. Critics have concocted grand theories for why Nevermind exploded. Was it a rejection of metal? A subconscious rebellion against Reaganomics? Some deep generational cry for help? Or maybe they just heard the song and lost their minds. Teen Spirit was impossible to ignore. Simple, explosive, and hooky as hell. Grunge went from a niche scene in a rainy city to one where every record label is slapping money on any band that looked like they hadn't showered in a week. Rolling Stone, the magazine that tends to get every single thing wrong, called it the new Liverpool, which is ironic because nobody in Seattle cared anything about being compared to the Beatles. Meanwhile, bands that spent years grinding in small clubs, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, were suddenly thrust alongside Nirvana. And while Cobain might have been the reluctant poster boy for the movement, Pearl Jam ended up with the last laugh. 10 eventually outsold Nevermind in the long run. Yet grunge wasn't solely about new bands cashing in on the moment. Some older records also got a second life as well. Consider Temple of the Dog, one-off tribute project for Andrew Wood, the late singer of Mother Love Bone. He was a legend in the Seattle scene before anybody outside the city even knew what grunge was. His OD in 1990 hit the whole community hard, and his friends Chris Cornell, Eddie Vedder, and other future Pearl Jam members assembled Temple of the Dog as a tribute. Nobody expected it to be a big deal until grunge went nuclear, and this little passion project started selling like crazy. But fame hit these fans like a freight train, nearly derailing everyone involved. Jack and Dino from Sub Pop summed it up perfectly. One day you're a nobody playing in dingy clubs, and the next you can't even walk down the street without getting mobbed. And that kind of whiplash isn't something you just adjust to. Chris Novoselic, Nirvana's bassist, later admitted that the whole ordeal was traumatizing, going from total obscurity to being in the biggest band on the planet. And when your entire identity is built on rejecting the mainstream, but you suddenly become the mainstream, what the hell do you do? For Cobain, the answer was heroin. Not that he was alone in that. Seattle's grunge scene always had a dark undercurrent of addiction. But for Kurt, it wasn't solely about escape. It was about numbing the misery that came with being turned into a generational icon when he never wanted the job. The bitter irony was that he still maintained that rebellious, adolescent screw-you attitude to the bitter end. Yet the deeper he sank into heroin, the less he could hold it together. By 1994, he was circling the drain, exhausted, addicted, completely disillusioned with everything Nirvana had become. His death on April 5th was the final full stop at the end of grunge's sentence. No slow fade out, no graceful decline, just a single blast that shattered an entire movement. Steve Turner from Mudhoney nailed it, where he said Cobain's death didn't just cast a shadow over Seattle, it practically ended the city's reign as rock's epicenter. Grunge had rocketed from underground to global revolution in just a few short years, but Cobain's death confirmed that it was never built to last. The industry vultures had already moved on, labels were signing diluted grunge clones, and the whole phenomenon was collapsing under its own weight. When Cobain died, it wasn't merely the end of Nirvana, it was the beginning of grunge's demise. As a matter of fact, it really wasn't the mainstream that killed grunge. People say Kurt did. And when Cobain died, it wasn't merely the loss of a musician, it was the loss of that scene's reluctant leader. The one guy who never wanted the job. And without him, nobody was really truly willing to carry the torch, at least in the way that he did. Pearl Jam receded from the spotlight a bit, Soundgarden eventually folded, and Alice in Chains spiraled into addiction. And the movement really wasn't diluted, it just ended. And for those who lived through it, that moment, April 5th, 1994, was like a switch flipping. It wasn't just another rock star death. But what followed all of this? Cheap knockoffs, radio-friendly corporate alternative bands, and a whole lot of industry-manufactured angst. The pristine, untouchable quality that grunge once possessed was totally gone, never to return. Alice in Chains' MTV Unplugged performance stands as a haunting reminder. Layne Staley appeared almost as a ghost, barely holding himself together. His voice eerily spectral. People remarked that watching that show was like witnessing a man singing at his own funeral. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Grunge started off as the sound of rejection, pain, isolation, and in the end, it became the soundtrack to its own collapse. The underground scene, built on the rejection of corporate rock, was now being exploited by the very machine that it had scorned, producing a flood of soulless, diluted grunge clones churning out market-friendly angst. By the mid to late 90s, grunge was buried under emerging musical trends. One big shift was the rise of electronic music. The latter half of the 90s wasn't just about flannel and distortion. Drum and bass, trip-hop, and industrial sounds started taking hold, and that raw, dirty, analog quality of grunge began to feel a bit more like a relic. At the same time, heavy music morphed into something new. Enter nu metal, Korn, Deftones, Limp Bizkit. These bands took the down-tuned guitars of grunge, polished them, mixed them in hip-hop, electronic beats, and arena-sized production. It was less about rejecting fame and more about embracing the chaos. Where grunge had always been about self-destruction and introspection, nu metal turned up the volume and said, screw it, let's hit the gym, party, and punch something while we're at it. Across the pond, Britpop was thriving, with bands like Oasis and Blur taking alternative rock into an entirely different direction. Cheeky swagger and Beatles worship replaced nihilistic grunge anthems. And even within grunge's own ranks, evolution was underway. By the late 90s, the genre had blurred into a broader alternative rock sound. The Foo Fighters are a prime example. Dave Grohl, Nirvana's drummer, or former drummer, took what was left of Nirvana's DNA and ran with it, evolving it into something less brooding and more stadium-ready. The Color and the Shape, released in '97, retained grunge elements, but by that point, grunge was merely part of the larger alt-rock universe. Grunge might have come in like a wrecking ball, but it was definitely never built to last. The industry milked it dry. Its biggest figures fell apart, and by the late 90s, the world had moved on. And sure, the sound never fully disappeared, but its moment was definitely over. Clubs that once housed the scene began closing. The camaraderie among bands was dissolving. And yet, while the Seattle scene died, grunge itself never truly did. The music, the attitude, the unvarnished energy, the rejection of pretense lived on in its own weird way. It forced producers to take a more organic approach to recording. It was both a blessing and a curse. You had bands that were obviously not grunge trying to make sense of it all by copying the style. Def Leppard tried it. It did not pan out very well for them at all. Metallica too, and it made people look at them kind of weird. Their fans gave them the stink eye. But ironically, the very scene that shunned rock stardom became one of the most revered movements in rock. These weren't overblown figures living in mansions. They looked like the people who listened to them. And that's why it resonated so deeply. Grunge didn't just perform alienation, it embodied it. Yet the moment it got too big, the industry turned it into a commodity, and the weight of fame crushed those who made it real. And while grunge's DNA is everywhere, in alternative rock, the moodier side of emo, even modern hip-hop, its true form, that gritty, organic vibe, was never really meant to be replicated. You could slap that label on new bands or throw on a thrift store flannel and call it a revival, but the moment that was grunge, the genuine, unsanitized essence, remains a once-in-a-lifetime explosion. Could grunge ever truly come back? Not really. Not in the way it existed in the early 90s. That was a singular explosion born out of a perfect storm of frustration, disillusionment, and an unsuspecting music industry. And honestly, that's really what makes it matter. Grunge wasn't built for permanence. It wasn't designed for a second act. It arrived, it wrecked everything in its path, and it left behind something that still resonates decades later. Time couldn't erase it. It came, it burned, and somehow those embers are still glowing. Now, I covered Kurt Cobain's life and career in full detail, and also Layne Staley as well from Alice in Chains. I left both links below in the description. To my subscribers, can I just say, you friggin' rock. I want to thank you so much. And if you haven't had the chance to subscribe yet, stick your tongue out a la Gene Simmons and give that subscribe button a really nice good lick. And while you're at it, then reach over to the right with your head and also lick that like button as well. Do each only an odd number of times a piece. Otherwise, it undoes all that hard work that you managed to do. Join the family. I want to thank you so much for watching.